We had a one-on-one conversation, and I loved kind of not only the ability to be vulnerable with that one person one-on-one, but at the same time, he just gave really great advice on how to continue to not buck up. I would not say that, but it was like, hey, think about this from this perspective. That was really great. I needed that. Thank you. Being able to say to a leader, like, hey, I'm pissed about something. I don't understand this. Like, break this out for me. Give me some advice. Like, help me be better. I also have appreciated being able to ask that. And again, in an authentic way, that's me. And it's not coming across as like disparaging or that I'm not equipped to do my job.
Hey, this is Gareth Webb, and you're listening to Breakout, a show that cuts through the hiring noise. Here, you'll get an unfiltered view on what early and growth stage companies are doing so that you can take their best practices, processes, and frameworks and implement them to help you build teams more confidently. So firstly, thank you for coming to Austin. It's
Thanks
nice
for
to
having
see
me.
you for the first time in 2 years, and I think it's 2 years and is it 2 years to the date, roughly? I think April. When did you join Axon?
January. So 2.5.
Oh my word. Okay. Yeah, I do remember my first conversation with you. Do you remember your first conversation with me?
I remember being introduced to you as like, hey, this guy knows his stuff. We need you to kind of hop on the phone and feel him out and see if we're right or wrong. I was like, all right, sounds good.
I remember being told by Elizabeth and Josh, yeah, we've got the new head of talent acquisition. And I was like, I think COVID was just starting to unravel. And I'm not intimidated, but put on the back foot very quickly. But I was like, okay, yep, this Gabrielle's taking charge. But I think we quickly kind of had some good wins with you guys.
Yeah.
You guys have fast become a very, very good client. I think what we wanted to do today is talk about what Axon does particularly well. And for us, that's the brand is very unique. The vision is very unique. And I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but even just hearing Rick speak yesterday,
Yeah,
I'd say he's probably up there with the top CEOs that I've come across. And so like anything, I think in teams and cultures and performance related matters, it comes from top down. I'd say what you've done, and this is what I want to talk about, is how you have extended an esoteric kind of product or brand to become a full employer brand, how you build that story when you're scaling hiring program at speed, because a lot of companies get it wrong. So what do you put that down to? When you joined Axon, what was your kind of mindset entering that environment, and what did you decide to build out? What was the kind of initial bit of thinking when you first started?
Yeah. Well, so going back in time to January 2020, right? Public safety professionals actually had an incredible cachet, if you will, at that moment in time. And so when I started, it was, hey, scale, grow like crazy. Here's our headcount plan. Here's what we want to do. And I was, woo, we're already behind. Right. And the brand isn't, even now, it is much better. It's getting firmer. We're doing a lot more to craft it and really curate the talent brand, but it really didn't exist, right? And so I think there was so much of, I don't know what this company is, but I know that police are doing a lot of good. And so many people actually intrinsically associate Axon with just policing, yeah, which is inherently not, it's very true, but also not true at the same time. So it's really again, public safety. So in January 2020, we were building out recruitment marketing, thinking about recruiting and ads very much of, hey, come and work, to make the good guys even better. Fast forward to May of 2020 and George Floyd was murdered. And in a second, not only are we dealing with the pandemic of people don't know who we are, we're doing everything remote, everything's virtual, don't really have that brand, to dealing with such a terrible thing that had happened in the United States. And instantaneously, we were kind of thinking about how we curate and craft our story to be able to better connect with candidates, to actually really talk about the transparency of what we do and why we do it. And you never want to take for granted how quickly something can change. And overnight, our entire branding completely had to change. So anything from candidates being really frustrated by an ad that they would see featuring a police officer at that time, we had actually took it down and started thinking about, hey, how do we talk about our technology in really different ways and not maybe perhaps that end customer at that moment in time. And then you kind of come full circle, a year later, when there's a lot of different things happening in the ecosystem with defund police, and you have to pay attention and you have to kind of read your audiences, or you're never going to appeal to that talent side of it, right? So Now, I think, again, like 2 years after the pandemic, I think the thing that we've got from a scale perspective and how we think about our storytelling is, again, really like that transparency. Truly, like Rick did such an amazing job day before yesterday. I think it was on Tuesday. So he did such an amazing job. And one of the things that really kind of struck even closer to home was Tuesday afternoon, the Texas elementary school shooting and, 21 people dying. And he put out an amazing message on our Slack channel that inherently, like, we need to use our talent for good. And so we have a true, genuine opportunity to use the time that you're away from your family, how we think about everything that touches our products and what we do, and using that talent for good. Not a lot of companies have that ability to not only say it, but actually live it and act it through their values, through their choices, through their customer engagements and interactions. And so I think we're at a really interesting inflection point, truly, not only in the United States, but I think globally as well.
Being very reflective as a Brit that's moved to Texas and then seen that happen and seen everything that's happened in the last 2-3 years, it's getting more and more complicated. Living in America is very, very complex, interwoven set of values. And I think the thing about Rick for me is like, there's no side. Like, he's not on a side. He's just like, in his message the other day, he said, like, I feel like we failed. It's like, well, you're trying very hard to solve big problems, but you still feel that way. And he's a guy that's been very successful, and yet he's still very, very, very driven to take it to the next level. So I think
he's also a human being that what my favorite things, not only about Rick, but also his leadership, is we've also failed like epically, in epic proportions. I mean, the company almost went under back in the 90s, right? And so I think that's kind of something too that I have appreciated as well, is like having the space to innovate and fail. And it's not necessarily you celebrate those failures, but you definitely learn from them and you plat forward. I think having that environment truly from the top down is also a really big deal.
So for you then, like going through probably what was one of the more tumultuous onboarding periods to go in as a head of talent, like not many people would have been able to do such a good job, to now be scaling out, like, what is it, 100 people a month trying to...
Right now it's 100 to 125 per month. But at the same time, right, like we're trying to be really thoughtful right now about 2 weeks ago, the market was really different than it is right now, right? Yep. So I think, again, it's also being really intelligent. Like, we're really focused on EBITDA. We're really focused on our revenue production and talent and the pace of hiring. Obviously, you have to be really thoughtful so that you don't rob Peter to pay Paul. Yep. And so I absolutely kind of appreciate how the business of hiring also goes hand in hand to the success of the company. We have had to scale really quickly globally to kind of bring in those numbers, but we have to be agile and nimble enough to then adapt quickly to the changing needs of the company.
And so how do you, the bit I definitely experienced early, we experienced early with Axon, and that you guys talked about even with your employer branding, and you put us in touch with your employer branding agency early, which was very helpful. Not many people do that. Has much changed in the kind of way you deliver the storytelling? You talk about, like, it was early days, it was enforcement and public safety. Now it's about transparency and tech for good. Is there like a way you roll out that storytelling and the narrative to the broader company, like not just talent acquisition, but like executives, management, team members that are interviewing, to make sure that everyone's delivering the same kind of narrative?
Well, so we probably could candidly do a little bit better job from like that true storytelling and giving probably more guidance on that. But here's the piece of it. And I think maybe this is also who I am as a person too. Every human being who tells their story, it's their story. And so having like the level of authenticity of, I'm not reading from a script or a playbook. We've got really fascinating, very authentic employee stories as to why they work at Axon. The best thing I can do is let them tell their story as to why they're here. And interestingly enough, I think candidates have called out repeatedly that the stories are a little bit different, but the call to action related to our values and being impressed by, like, wow, everyone said something a little bit different, but all said the exact same thing. Right. And so while we don't necessarily publish those talking points, we do fan them up. Like, why did you join? Tell me your story, when we're actually doing like hiring manager intakes. And a lot of that is to kind of start getting them to think through the eyes of the candidate of, hey, well, what's your pitch? Why should someone come and leave a big 10, tech company and come on task? We're a 2,700 person company. Like, why take that risk? And so I think, again, like that authenticity, I think, has served us really, really well without necessarily overly analyzing the storytelling piece of it too.
Yeah. everyone joins a company for different reasons, and that's to be celebrated. It shouldn't be that everyone joins for the same reason. I think what we see is with brands like Axon, they're not the comp and things like that come into play whenever someone takes a job. But the reality is you are definitely competing with folks with deeper pockets, right? With
Without question.
Microsoft and that. So you and those types of brands, where do you sit with the thing I remember picking out from the conversation with your employer branding agency was like, look, we're going to be a sell and repel type proposition. We know that. But now the diversification of product suite and technologies and the application across like EMS or virtual reality, that probably doesn't need to be the case necessarily. Like if someone's anti-police, they could still do very good work at Axon. Is that still the case, or do you find that there is more of a middle ground and some of those middle ground candidates can be like catered for or account, like there's a place for them if they have the right kind of like candidate experience early on?
Well, I'm going to kind of unpack that ever so slightly and make sure I answer it in the way that you were hoping me to. So when I think about the model right now at Amazon, right, where you like put your resume into a bot and it kind of, parses it out and gives you a pretty generic candidate experience. And then you get your offer and you don't really know where you're going to go. I think that there's economies of scale that have influenced maybe some of the ways that we've restructured some of our hiring processes, but it's never gotten away from understanding the motivators for a candidate and what makes them tick so that we can most align them most appropriately to the role that they'll be the most successful in.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily say it's hey, come get this experience and then head out, because again, over the years, we have been continuing to expand the suite of products and the suite of services. So you just highlighted VR, obviously. So we're seeing a lot more people pop in and around to different pillars and departments than we probably have in the past. And that's one, great from a retention perspective. Diversity of thought is obviously really important.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think, again, if you can grow yourself and find different ways to keep kind of buckling back up to the table and getting some more experiences, people will hang tight and stay. We've definitely seen that. At the same time, depending on our candidate and the candidate profile, again, we're a small enough company where there are some people that go from startup into a smaller size company to kind of get that experience. And candidly, to your point about deeper pockets, in particular, in the last 5 months, we've seen a lot of our employees go to some of the big box tech companies. One, from a pay perspective, and two, because they want that experience of, hey, if I don't check it off my list at this point, when am I ever going to do it? And not pigeonhole themselves. So I appreciate that, but I still think that there's a lot of runway to be able to kind of bring that in and keep building that at Axon too.
So would you say you are less of a sell and repel type brand now? Would you say you're more of a larger technology company which has more of a suite?
We're a growing technology company. I would not put us in the category of large by any stretch.
Right.
And what I love about that, though, is we do have the dollars to be able to go after innovation and pitches that maybe weren't there the year before. And the VR space is a perfect example. We hired our leader of VR back in August, July of last year. And he quickly kind of did a deep dive of our business model, what was working, what wasn't. We added 30 people into that organization. And it's one of our, again, top money making in overnight at Axon. That's awesome and crazy. That didn't exist 18 months ago in that same way. And so what I have appreciated is, again, a lot of people want to build something that matters and they can touch it and it's tangible and they can kind of see end to end that build. A lot of times you don't necessarily get to see that as closely at some of those larger companies. And so I do think that people are sticking a little bit longer than they have had in the past. Yeah. So less sell and repel.
And so with when you're getting people come through the door at Axon, is there like a pattern of where people tend to come from now? Are they come, you obviously...
No, it's actually fun. And I love that, right? And I think so much of that too is we were really, 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 again, we adapted fast in COVID. When I first joined in January of 2020, there was a little bit of hesitancy to not hire engineers that weren't willing to relocate to Seattle, as an example. Yeah. COVID kind of hit. It continued to kind of go on and on and on, no end in sight. And it was one of those things where if we don't adapt now, we're going to miss out on something bigger for when we come out of this.
Yeah.
And so I think because we were able to quickly adapt to hiring anyone anywhere, and obviously there's learnings, there's sacrifices, there's trade-off for doing that. But we've definitely seen kind of some of the richness of different perspectives, different companies. It's not all from one size fits all. And I really like that. There was a period of time where we were hiring a lot of people out of the Pacific Northwest tech companies. I think we've actually inherently gotten away from that, but without intention.
Yeah, just because you can.
Yeah.
Because you've embraced remote.
Yeah.
Where you've been at like two of the biggest prior to Axon. So I'm asking you now as like a talent leader personally, not as the Axon head of talent, but what are the things you've brought into the environment, and what are the things that you've just had to create from scratch, like given that we're in a completely new world?
Yeah.
And what are the things that have equipped you well, and what are the things you've had to get fully creative with?
Yeah. The talent team had never had the hiring plan in a given year until the year I started. Right. And so I don't say that in a boastful way, but I think inherently, again, athlete at heart. And so it's like you compete. If you say you're going to do something, you figure out ways to do it.
Right. So they had no goals.
What was that?
They had no goals. Like
they had goals, they just weren't successful at hitting them. And so I'm a very goal-oriented human. I think the other thing is I don't think our businesses really understood that they had an equal part share in being successful in the hiring process. And so I think there was we had to adapt a little bit. And perhaps this is also, yes, from coming from some of those bigger companies where I saw account management done really, really well. There's that fine line of being scrappy and being overly flexible, as you and I have found out even in our partnership together, where that is either a good thing or that actually it doesn't scale. And we really had to kind of come to some mutual expectations of, hey, to scale and to hit these numbers, we're all invested. Yeah. We all have to have really strong conversations on what our hiring bar is. We have to get really, really crisp on interviewer training. We have to get very crisp on candidate experience. I need to resource the team in the right way. We need to add in metrics for recruiters to be able to directionally know what's successful. But for me personally, the biggest thing that I think I brought in and then had a radically different approach from my prior companies to Axon is, at Amazon, it was very much about recruiter productivity. And if a recruiter didn't have that productivity with the specific metrics, they were out. That's kind of an interesting approach when you're thinking about human beings and security and stability, and actually leaning into, again, a company mission. Like if you want somebody to lean into that talent brand and to really, again, speak that truth, you can't make it that your job is in limbo if you don't make this quota in a 3-month period of time. Right. And so it was something that Luke and I talked really honestly about in my interview process of like, hey, I'm a team sport person. And so I will always lead a team by giving the team the goal. But if the team doesn't hit the goal and every single pillar of our business, then we inherently fail. For recruiters successful and they hit their goal, bully. But if one recruiter hit their goal and 10 others didn't, then we actually were not successful. Yeah. And so I re-architected and re-engineered how we actually thought about landing plan and created a culture as well where recruiters know, like, hey, I cleared my book of business off my desk and I know I'm going to be asked to kind of jump into the next urgent thing of the company. And I think that's good from a career development perspective, but it's been really great from a retention perspective as well.
Yeah. What's the team size now?
57 globally.
Talent acquisition. Including operations and... Yeah,
we've got a recruiting operations, we've got a data analyst, we've got recruitment marketing program manager. I do have a program manager. We've really streamlined our referral process, internal transfer process, constantly looking at, again, the return on investment with our tools and our systems. And candidly, it's becoming more of let's eliminate waste. Let's be more efficient with what we've got. Let's not just add in more bodies. And so I think talent leaders who can, and again, I did learn that a lot of that methodology and thinking from other companies that I've brought in, but we're twisting it to make sure that it's landing the Axon plan and not I'm not carbon copying something that I learned 10 years ago at Microsoft. Because candidly, I don't even think Microsoft's probably doing it that way anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, things have changed a lot. Going into an org, so there wasn't a talent acquisition leader prior to you joining?
There had been a few.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it hadn't been ironed out and
I think again, from what I understand, honestly, I think that there might have just been focus on the individual business lanes and not necessarily at the totality of the company. And for me, again, in the role that I had at Amazon, it was very much across 7 different business lanes, and they were not alike in any way, shape, or form. And being able to understand the ticking pieces of each of those business and really, again, align talent to hit those ticks was absolutely something I brought in that I just don't know had been done before.
Right. So the way I kind of view what you've done is almost experience design for the stakeholders and for candidates, true program design and program rollout. You haven't just stuck recruiters on seats and said, right, let's hit these numbers. You've probably brought in some of the best bits of Microsoft, some of the best bits of Amazon and the accountability, but then tailored that for what the brand of Axon is and kind of how it works and how it innovates and how it commercializes. The bit I think that's interesting, knowing the people of Axon, and there's like very strong characters across the exec, and there's very different types of personalities. Like what are you, if you're like talking to the next like head of talent for a high growth business like an Axon, like what are the things that you have developed as a leader and as an account manager, as you mentioned, or stakeholder management? What are the things that the tools you have and the skills you've developed, like that make you effective at the job?
I would encourage anyone to actually think about talent acquisition like a product and have a product roadmap, and think again, like how do we continue to not rest on your laurels, but iterate and meet the company objectives, right? So I very much have a quarter by quarter talent roadmap. We are constantly looking at our tools. We're constantly looking again, like, hey, how are we adding that in? We're working through being better actually at being far more transparent than with our business partners on, hey, here's our product roadmap. Here's where that ask kind of falls in there. Here's where it's stacked ranked against. Here's what we can and cannot do. That's helped with kind of, again, a lot of really strong opinions of the company. I very much value the different opinions that my executive leaders have. They are not the same. And so it is my job to actually partner with them to think about their talent strategy that fits their business. And again, like that makes me as a shareholder equally successful, right? So I think about people operations in general. It's not just actually talent acquisition of, hey, our role in any company is to kind of get into the heartbeat of that human experience, both on the front end of recruitment and then the employee experience, and land that talent plan with that leader to really help their vision come to life for the company. That's a cool place to be in. I think leaders will sometimes get really into the nitty gritty of stuff that defining metrics and KPI, super, super important, but there's more than that. And again, I think anybody coming in and having to scale, it really is like understanding, hey, what do my leader, where are we going so that I know. As an example, when I first started, Luke did a great job of sitting down and kind of like, hey, here's the number of employees we have now. Here's where we'll probably be by 2023. Here's where we'll probably be by 2025. I knew really, really early on, I couldn't just sit and let it be. We had to keep figuring out and ticking away to be able to kind of meet that. And candidly, we're still very much in the middle of that journey. We're not anywhere done yet, which is why it's fun to come to work every day, right? Yeah. But I think, again, like new leaders need, any leader kind of going through that kind of growth and scale needs to not get overly fixated on the number of roles in that 1 minute in time, because they won't look future forward to maybe the 30% growth that's coming the next year, that maybe they're building processes that won't work anymore.
Right. Past performance does not indicate future success, like in any part of business. But I think especially at the moment with talent acquisition, I'm sure it's changed and it's changing, but where does like talent acquisition, the bleeding into people ops, like where does it stop? Or does it just not? Because they're your super collaborative team. Yeah. Like where do you allow your team to continue post hire, and in terms of like culture definition and retention, where do you guys pass over to people ops, and then what's that feedback loop between the two orgs?
No, it's probably one of the best people ops groups that I've been a part of in my career, and it is very, very collaborative. It's also under-resourced, and so again, like we've had to be really thoughtful about every single one of those resources and what they do and how they do it.
In terms of budget,
I mean, and again, meeting that scale, right? When you think about general administrative functions, as it rightly should be, like those are the last places that you invest in as a company, right? You invest in your sales, you invest in your product. G&A comes last. Totally cool. Everybody knows that. And so it's our job as well to then design our processes where we can be lean and scrappy without kind of, to your point, like killing culture, killing kind of, again, that the onboarding experience. We've done a really interesting job through the pandemic of kind of doing virtual things, virtual engagements from every, like, again, like even the handoff, right? Like how are those hiring managers reaching out and making sure that they're having at least a weekly touch point with those people before they start? What does that new hire orientation look like? We've really overhauled and looked at a lot of like our onboarding processes. We've added in something called the Yoda, and you like us and our Star Trek and our Trekkie things, but it's essentially your onboarding ambassador essentially. And so we really want to make sure people aren't just kind of coming in and they don't know where they fall and, into the ecosystem until they really kind of get their feet under their ground or on the ground. So it's usually about 3 months that we're kind of helping navigate that experience. We didn't have that until the beginning of this year. And that was really based off of feedback that we got from our employees of like, hey, I'm leaving the company because I just had a terrible experience in the pandemic of here I am sitting in my home office. I don't really understand the culture. I don't really understand what's expected of me. We unpack that to figure out that's actually happening in those first 90 days. And so that's really where the Yoda program kind of came into play there. For us, that handoff is truly like, hey, after that hire acceptance, obviously passing that background check, it gets handed off to our onboarding team. And we will stay in touch to be able to then get feedback from our HR business partners on that 90-day like feedback loop on how's it going? What do we need to be doing differently? How do we need to be iterating? I think though the one thing, and regardless of company, whether it's ours or any other company, if you don't actually really own that yourself and have a little bit of vulnerability, I'm like, I am not picking up this and it's frustrating me. What resources can you point me to go and figure this gap out for myself? I think people are really, really concerned about, hey, I want to show up in a certain way in a new role. And I think if you don't really seize the opportunity to be new when you're new and learn as much as you can and ask the dumb questions that aren't really all that dumb and be that intellectual curiosity into that first part of your onboarding experience, then yeah, you're going to probably have some dissatisfaction regardless of where you go.
Yeah, because whether you're remote or in office, like there's always something to complain about.
Always.
Right. It's like, oh, there's not enough people in the office and I like being in a busy office, or the day I come in, there's only 2 of us in, or my leader wasn't here. So you're basically saying it's like joint responsibility between talent, people, hiring manager, and
It's very much a shared responsibility. Yeah. Our sales team does a really nice job of, they have a training team do that ramp and onboarding with our sales leaders. We just had a director of learning and development. She started about 2 months ago. And so again, like I'm pretty excited to see she's really crafting out how to make hiring like managers more effective. People don't always leave a company. Sometimes they leave a leader. And so how do we actually really lean into our leaders and really build out those capabilities? Who's ready to be a leader? Who's not? How do you...
Is she L&D for the sales org or just for the management?
For the company.
For the whole company, head of L&D. Okay, for internal L&D, not like, okay, interesting. Yeah, because I think L&D is one of those things that everybody says they want, but then when you give it to them, they don't always like embrace it or convert.
Well, it's also a hard thing to understand. I actually have having recruited for that role personally and getting her into the role, I have a lot of empathy in that it's also a hard thing to quantify. How do you actually directionally say, like, you need to develop learning plans for your individual contributors or your leaders? What are the metrics that are going to tell me if that's successful or not? Did that work? And here we are, you could be a year later and engagement surveys are still the same. Is this working? Is this not? Like it's actually a really interesting space to be able to have a backbone, define, and then like stick to that strategy and kind of talk to the why we're doing what we're doing, how it's going, what's working, what's not.
Cool. Yeah. Let's talk about the word you just said, actually, backbone, because I would say back to the start of our conversation, like when I first met you, I was like, okay, this person's like very well equipped for this job, very well equipped, obviously dealt with some punchy execs at Microsoft. Amazon's probably like as punchy as it gets, very different culturally, but like still having the backbone as a talent acquisition leader or in any leadership role, but especially talent acquisition where you're being told by people who think they know best in their function, right? Like product people know best, salespeople know best about their craft. Your craft is selling an organization, building out roadmaps for hiring, making sure those things happen. What's the balancing act between sticking to your guns and following through and influencing versus like sometimes pulling back and being like, cool, like you do your way and we'll see how it goes? How have you historically balanced that in all 3 orgs?
Threading the needle, right? Okay. It's taken me years to kind of figure out my own personal style to be able to really truly navigate in a gray space. I would not say that I'm a black and white human being, but I found out really, really early on at Microsoft when I was working with these extremely high level leaders when I was not a very high level human being that I got actually further by kind of almost that seek to understand approach of, hey, this is really important to you. Technically, this is not our process or our policy, but that's a black and white thinking versus, okay, hey, how can I set my team up for success, still be in process, but maybe tiptoe into that gray to get them a little bit more of what they want to be able to build that trust and build confidence in our team. So I've really honed and crafted in on what is important to a leader while not taking shit. And candidly, as a female in the tech space, it was something that I very much had my emotions about early on in my career. I remember having this conversation with one of my leaders at the time. You're very passionate. Like, isn't that a good thing? He was like, sometimes. Right. And he didn't mean it in any kind of like a derogatory way, but it made me honestly think about like, okay, my passion is coming out as frustration versus, hey, I can be passionate about something. I can stick to my guns to it, but I understand that it's far more business. It's not personal now after many years of doing this. Having punchy people, right? Like, that's one of my favorite things. If people weren't passionate, if they weren't being punchy, they probably actually aren't the right people that you want to partner with.
Yeah, they're not very good at what they do. They lack conviction. I think poker facing your passion is probably a skill. Like, let it out when the right time comes about. And
I think in your safe places too, right? I had our former CFO. I had a really great relationship with him, and he was very much, I was in Scottsdale a couple weeks back, and it was one of those things like, hey, like this is really bugging me. We had a one-on-one conversation, and I loved kind of not only the ability to be vulnerable with that one person one-on-one, but at the same time, he just gave really great advice on how to continue to not buck up. I would not say that, but it was like, hey, think about this from this perspective. Like, that was really great. I needed that. Thank you. Being able to say to a leader, like, hey, I'm pissed about something. I don't understand this. Like, break this out for me. Give me some advice. Like, help me be better. I also have appreciated being able to ask that. And again, an authentic way. That's me. And it's not coming across as like disparaging or that I'm not equipped to do my job. It's just like, man, I'm pissed about this. How do I figure this out? How do I unpack this? How do I break
that's how you like get towards truth, is by, so yeah, like having the ability to vent or show that you don't understand how to get somewhere. That just opening up that dialogue should make a really good leader like rise to the occasion and be like, this is why I'm a leader. Because like, even if it's a peer, like you're talking to a former CFO, they should see that as an opportunity to say, I'm here to do my job now, like help somebody one-to-one, which is way more important than doing a broadcast on Zoom to a bunch of folks, which is actually quite easy. I think it's also the opposite of apathy, which I think is the killer, like in any team environment or business. Like if I sense apathy, that's like the no-no. False positivity is really irritating. And I've experienced that at a former company I worked at, where everything's great and you can't say you're pissed about something. And I think that, the culture of being able to say you're pissed, or you don't know how to do something, or there's a problem but you just don't know how to fix it, like that's probably the ultimate business environment to be in. I would have thought, as long as there is a way to fix it and there's smart enough people to know where the solution lies. How are we doing for time? We're okay. Yeah, cool. We'll just cut that bit out. Yeah, I think the final thing I would sort of want to discuss is, like you just said earlier, that the market's changed in 2 weeks. It seems to change every few weeks. It's either like becoming harder to hire, or then there's layoffs happening, or there's geopolitical seismic shifts. What do you see, like whilst I've got you here, like what do you see is the real problems on the horizon for not just you and Axon, but just in talent acquisition in general? Like where do you see big problems and trends in the industry that could make it even more complicated than it already is?
Yeah, I'm a huge history buff in general. I always like kind of looking back a little bit. So when I look back at like 2008, I don't think we're anywhere near that level. But I mean, I remember the hiring freeze and a snap overnight at Microsoft. I think if you are smart enough to be paying attention to the market and what that then means to your bottom line as a company, and then how that impacts the talent team, is really inherently important. And so what I mean by that is, if you take your eye off of the ball for 2024, 2025, because of an economic shift in the market, you won't be able to bounce back in the same way for what's to come from a success perspective as well. So being really thoughtful again about crafting that brand, being really, really intentional and thinking about, hey, talent management, where are we at now? Where do we have gaps? How are we building those strategies and those processes and those tools to go and fill those gaps in the future? If you have the luxury to be able to be intentional with your hiring and not have to go through layoffs and things like that, which not everybody has that luxury. So I completely understand that. If you have the luxury to kind of weather that storm and really position yourself for the second that we come out of it, then you're going to be, again, like that company that can really capitalize on that from a hiring perspective, from a revenue perspective. And I think that, again, those are the things you just have to be paying attention to. I think people who are only thinking about hiring right now and going against the competitor on their left and right, it's really short-sighted. They absolutely need to be, again, like reading our friends over at JP Morgan and like, why are they making the decisions that they're doing? Why are those choices happening? Which companies are we seeing most impacted by that? What are their reactions? Is there something that neither I can learn, or can I go and poach their talent because they immediately overnight went to a pretty interesting, rocky company, and our company has a pretty large foundation of stability. And so being able to actually be really pinpointed in our reach outs and our engagement, not with people that are getting laid off, like the lists that are circulating right now, right? It's actually going after the people that are very well employed there, that are probably in their top performing kind of like segments that we really want to grab in because they're some of their best salespeople or their best engineers. How do we go actually craft a pitch for them? So if you can weather that storm from a talent acquisition team, be smart about what's happening, read the tarot cards a little bit, you can kind of weather that storm. But again, that's obviously at this exact moment in time, like, we have no plans to do any riffs or layoffs. We're not cutting our roles. We're being thoughtful and intentional. That's a unique position to be in.
I not want to dwell on bad news for certain folks, but the question you got to ask the question sometimes. They're neighbors of yours in Arizona. Is Carvana, right? Like they laid off 2,500 people.
Yeah. And a lot of them in the regional offices too. Like they had just set up, they literally just kind of launched and set up some really interesting business models, and then instantaneously got to pull those back.
But then I think the advice to candidates is ask the question when you're interviewing is, why has that company got such a huge headcount? Like, what's the revenue per head? What does the balance sheet look like? I think sometimes people need to get a job. So it's not like, you should never join a company. And like, as you said, you're not always in that position. But I think what's going on right now should have people being intentional about who you hire, where you join, if you can do that. Because a lot of these companies, especially the bloated out, overfunded tech companies, are nowhere near EBIT positive. That they've just used hiring as a vanity metric almost to be like, look how big we are and how great we are. Whereas that's the thing I think with you guys, that you clearly have. There's no maybes that get through the door with Axon, right? It's like
I'm actually really proud of our hiring bar. It can be sometimes frustrating. I would much rather, and I mean, that's the same thing with candidates. Like, make sure you're sure. Interview as much as you're being interviewed, right? Because truly, like, it's miserable to be not only make a bad hire, but to be a bad hire any which way, right? So I think, again, some of the bloat that you're seeing in the tech industry has also been, and we're also like no different from this either, right? Like, we want to do everything. Just like they do. And I think where we're really seeing kind of some maturation of our own company and like, okay, just because we want to do everything, should we? Yeah. And so I think we've had to have some growing pains through that too, right? If we don't invest, if we don't fix and like really shore up, this one product offering before we move on to the next, we're going to create friction with our customers. We're not going to sell as much as we want. We're not going to have the impact that our company desires to have. Yeah. So let's maybe hold on that wonderful idea for 6 months, a year, and really sure. I have appreciated some of those learnings even in my time with the company. And I think some of the other tech companies, again, it's so big. There's a lot of different silos. There's a lot of shotgun approach. And so I also wonder if some of that is, instead of asking the critical question 6 months ago or a year ago, like, should we? I think it was like, let's go forth and do. And now you're seeing all these layoffs happen, to your point about the EBITDA.
And doing things right and doing things well means sometimes waiting. And like I think Axon has customers with their logo like tattooed on their arm and leg. And
yes,
like
there's a tattoo culture. I don't have any personally. Rick has this huge, like almost arm full of it. And he's filled in, different teaser every single time. Different goals have been met.
But that when your customers it's one thing for your CEO and chief revenue officer to have them, but when your customers have them, then you probably want to kind of like continue in that vein where the quality and the impact you're having on their lives is, I'm a fan, I'm not a customer. Cool. Thank you very much for the honesty and insight. I think a lot of people will have stuff to think about after hearing this, and we'll have you down again soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Breakout. If you want to hear more, make sure to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to be the first to get notified when future episodes are released. If you like this show or want to share feedback, please leave a review so we can keep improving and share the word with other leaders in the tech talent space. If you have suggestions for topics we should cover, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Gareth.